For the month of November, beautiful time of the year. We got a little rain that we needed today. The cane farmers are having a wonderful harvest. Good, dry, beautiful, clear weather, nice and cool. So, hope that goes well for the rest of the year. It's very important to our economy. The sugarcane crop is a very important part to Louisiana and the nation. So, uh, we had a guest tonight. That was Chris Tozan, the chairman of the St. Martin Parish Council, and he had some emergencies come up and he's had to cancel out. So my apologies for that, and I'm sure he extends his. So he's going to give us a rain check maybe in the next program. But the subject still is going to be St. Martin Parish and how it affects our waterways and especially the flooding situation in Lafayette and the whole Acadiana area. Uh, St. Martin Parish is super important to Lafayette for one major reason. The backwards flow of the Vermilion, the northward flow of the Vermilion, which is very significant, moving at a very high speed rate. Um During the flood of '16, the Vermilion district, with their own monitoring, was showing almost 12,000 cubic feet per second going north into Cypress Island, which is St. Martin Parish. Now, the water going to the Cypress Island has one main entry point. It comes in where Bayou Tartu hits the Vermilion right at the airport, right on the north end of the north-south runway. And that opening is very small. The bayou is about 5 million. There is about 125 feet wide and about 10 to 12 feet deep. And Bayou Tartu is about 50 feet wide and about 6 feet deep. And when the water got high, it would overcome the banks of that swamp between the Lake Martin Road and the airport, about a mile. And when the Corps dredged the Vermilion Bayou in 1950 with a big walking bucket dredge that I watched as a boy, they put all the spoil on the swamp side, which made an unintentional dam. And it's our hopes that part of that dam be removed. Now it's run into a hiccup because the people of St. Martin Parish are concerned that it'll raise water levels and flood more people. They already got a bad taste in their mouth from the '16 flood when the Cypress Island residences in St. Martin Parish were flooded for over 30 days. And part of that long duration is the fact that it doesn't have enough drain out. And so we've tried to work with St. Martin Parish to get, one, their people better informed, and two, to overcome the big public opposition in St. Martin Parish residents out of concern that this is sending more Lafayette water to them. Problem is that Lafayette water is also coming in with the Lafayette water. You have water coming down from Bayou Catawba, the Bayou Teche, all the way from Alexandria through Bayou Cocodra and Bayou Buff and Bayou D'Arbonne, Bayou Waukesha, all these waters, Bayou de Glace, all these waters come down and comes into a hydro dam created by Lafayette's super efficient concrete coolers at Coulee-Ile-des-Canes, forms the hydro dam, very significant, and overfills Cypress Island, floods everybody. So when this first came up, Dr. Habib at UL didn't think that it was going to be of any merit to actually remove about a third of that spoil bank. Well, when he modeled it, to his astonishment and to ours, it showed that it reduced water levels about 8/10 of a foot. Quite significant because in the flood of '16, with 10,700 homes flooded from Alexandria to Abbeville, 73% had less than a foot of water. So 8/10 of a foot would have made a very big difference to lots of people that only had 2 or 3 inches. And so and a very low cost thing to do. Lafayette planned to remove that spoil and use it to build about a 100-acre retention pond over on the Lafayette Parish side. So this whole project, the spoil bank, is all in St. Martin Parish. So, but St. Martin Parish also has a bunch of other issues. What comes into Cypress Island is nearly all the water from Broussard. Most of the water from Youngsville travels north in Cypress Coulee, and LaSalle Coulee travels north into Cypress Island. So it's coming up to Vermilion, it's coming down to Vermilion from the Bayou Teche and Alexandria and all of that, and it's coming from Youngsville and Broussard and Cade. Part of Iberia Parish feeds into Cypress Island. And so Cypress Island is kind of a key to dealing with the flood. It can just hold so much, and then it starts backing up. It backs up Lafayette and backs up the coulees in Lafayette and the coulees into Broussard and into Youngsville. This is not something that you're going to fix with retention ponds. Retention ponds have little to do with a major flood. They'll quickly fill up with water, and then the flood takes over. So we are hoping that focusing on St. Martin Parish, and there are many other issues that St. Martin Parish is dealing with in this flood. The locks at Keystone between Broussard and New Iberia. Been there since 1913, and it's a navigation lock which has two functions. One was to raise the water level in the Teche, and from about 1908 to 1912 or so, they wrestled with the idea of having to dredge the Bayou Teche, because during low water it got way down, and it starts up there at Port Barry, tied into the Bayou Catawba, which went right into the Chaffelay River at the time. When the Chaffelay River went down to what it is now, 4 feet, it would dry out the Teche. The Teche is at 9-foot elevation, so the Teche you could walk across at times like this when the Chaffelay River was so low. You literally could walk across the Teche up from Leonville almost to Port Barry, 9-foot elevation, and the Bayou Catawba would go to 4. And so boats certainly couldn't go up there. So then they came up, the big argument was the only dredging then was by steam bucket dredges, which means you had to take out all the trees on one side. And the big argument was who would lose their beautiful oak trees. And that squabble went on and on. Finally, the court says the Teche doesn't carry flood water, which it didn't at the time. And so we can put a dam on it and a lock, so we'll raise the bayou to 10-foot elevation. That was kind of important because the water at Port Barry was 9. And so they hoped to put it at 10 and keep water in the Teche all the way, and at least handle enough water for tugs and barges to make it to the sugar mill in Brobridge, because the sugar mill wanted to haul sugar out by barge. Because 1913, we didn't have much for railroad service at that time. We did have railroad, but the barges were the cheapest way to move it, and our highways, there was no trucks running around in 1913, so the water transportation was everything. It was like the interstate highways. So they succeeded in building that dam in 1913. And it is a feature that requires very extensive maintenance to operate these locks. It has two big gates. The lock is about 500 feet long, 35 feet wide, and it raises the water level normally. Downside of the lock is at 3 feet, and it comes up 10. So a boat going upstream has to be brought in at low water, and get the lock behind them is closed, and then they pump water in. You have big valves that pump water in. It doesn't come through the gates as some locks do. They actually pump the water in and they pump the water out. Big baffle pumps. There's 4 of them. So this is very expensive to maintain, and in 2010 the Corps convinced St. Martin Parish they ought to buy it, and not buy it, actually received it as a donation. And it's something that probably, when they received it, it was needing many repairs, and today it needs all new gates. It probably needs new baffles. The foundation of the lock is very much in question, because it was placed on 969 50-foot pilings. The main lock structure is on these pilings because the subsurface of the bayou at that point was not sufficient to uphold the lock. Now, pilings, creosote pilings that were put down in 1913 are probably not there anymore, and probably the structure of the lock is very much in question. Pilings, according to an architect that's very knowledgeable on this subject, a piling in salt water, like in the Gulf, lives the longest, about 50 to 60 years, and the pilings in fresh water are a half of that. So we're saying 30 years is the life, and they have been there now, I think, 108 years. So it's not like these pilings are there. So, but the folks the volunteers who looked at this, worked with this, and the Corps itself, Mark Wingate, the president, chief civilian in the New Orleans District Office of the Corps Engineers, after the '93 flood, looked at how we could cure it. And they dealt with the Cypress Island swamp and putting a drain from the swamp into the Bayou Teche. And they looked at removing the lock and dam. And it's the dam feature that is the problem. Because the water from all the way up in Alexandria and all comes into the Bayou Teche and cannot go any further. It either has to go over the dams at Bayou Catawba into Bayou Ami, which goes right into Pat's Restaurant in in Henderson. So we have this fact that in normal water levels, like now, low water, all the water coming from Alexandria, Rapides, Avoyelles, Evangeline, St. Landry, even parts of Acadia, has to come into the Vermilion. And of course, the Vermilion is much smaller than the Teche, and so it's carrying more than its fair share. And the problem with that is it keeps Cypress Island full of water, to the point that Cypress Island now has become a lake. Nature Conservancy is a major owner of property there, and they're very concerned that lots of their trees are dying, and the swamp doesn't dry out anymore. So forage material for deer, forage plants that normally would feed ducks and rabbits and a whole list of deer and ground critters that have to feed on the grass that grows. It doesn't grow in the lake. And so it has an enormous impact on wildlife, including birds. And of course, the swamp staying flooded all the time is a big detriment to water quality. And so a swamp is something that functions with a rise and fall of the water. A good part of the year it might be totally dry when vegetation takes off and grows like crazy, which feeds crawfish, feeds deer, rabbits, and all kinds of birds that thrive on whatever plants grow during that wet and dry. Now, if you think that keeping the swamp underwater works, take your flower pot, fill your bathtub with water, and put it in the bottom of it and see how long it lives. So that's what's happening out there. So St. Martin Parish is very much the owner of most of the Cypress Island swamp. Uh, there's about 30,000 acres of wetlands in there, which varies in height. Some of the land is pretty high elevation, 12, 14-foot elevation, but during high water it does get wet. Near the flood of 2016, it got to around 15, 16 feet elevation, 15 and a half. Put the Lake Martin Road 2 feet underwater. And so that event showed the importance of Cypress Island. And so another big feature that is in St. Martin Parish that affects us, and by the way, when Mark Wingate did a computer model of his proposal to better drain Cypress Island and take out the Keystone Lock, he also included getting the Vermilion a little deeper, making it, instead of 11 feet deep, making it 12 or 13 feet deep. But that showed at low, worst case flood conditions in Lafayette to be lowered 6 to 8 feet. That's a phenomenal difference. But the biggest change is the Bayou Teche, because the Bayou Teche, the dam on it, forces a lot more water down to Vermilion. If you looked at it today, we're probably at 900 cubic feet per second going down to Vermilion, and 250 going over the dam. So usually 3 or 4 times more water going down to Vermilion than down to Teche. So it's our hope that at some point we get the Mississippi River Commission, who wrote the rule book of how we operate this Teche Vermilion freshwater district. It's not the board of that decides to do what. It's all decided by the Mississippi River Commission, and that rulemaking began in 1966, authorized by Congress in 1966. But the world has changed, and the intention was to improve water quality by making a good flow go down to Vermilion. And they would cite the example when they were arguing for this, that if you dropped a 2x4 in the Vermilion Bayou at Pinnock Bridge, it would take 48 days to make it to Vermilion Bay, about 50 miles from the Pinnock Bridge, right at a mile per day. And the plan of the Teche Vermilion was to have it move there in 50 hours. To maintain a 1 mile an hour flow, which would maintain fresh water in the entire system, including when the rice farmers were pumping during very dry conditions, the salinity would not only back up the bayou, but it would also back up into the well waters. Gaydon, all that area, Forked Island, their well waters start getting so much salt in it they'd have to quit pumping. So that part of it has been very successful, but the world has changed. Some of those changes impact St. Martin Parish a lot. One of them is the fact that the Wax Lake outlet has pretty much captured the flow of the Atchafalaya. The Wax Lake is 10 miles, Wax Lake outlet is 10 miles west of the river in Morgan City, and it gets higher than Morgan City, which puts a westward flow on the Intracoastal all the way to Intracoastal City and the Beaumont White Lake locks. And so that saltwater intrusion is somewhat changed because of the fact that the wax is pushing a lot more water down the Intracoastal, and further complicated by the closure of the Charenton Canal into West Coast Blanche Bay. The entire Tetraphymean system supposedly drains nearly all through the Charenton Canal and into West Coast Blanche Bay through an opening they call the Jaws. They did the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, I believe it's called, administration, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, had a project to build some terraces that would trap sediment. Well, it did just that. It closed this as a navigation waterway. Drilling barges used to go through it. Shell barges used to go through it. Lots of boats used it. And now an outboard has a tough time getting through. Even a small outboard has a very tough time getting through. So that impacts the water in Lake Lost Point, the top of which is all in St. Martin Parish. And so Lake Dotree is all in St. Martin Parish. All of these waters are impacted in a negative way. It means they get higher and they can carry less flood water during worst case conditions. All that water is trying to get to the bays in the Gulf, and with that blocked off, it causes lots of problems. One of it is you have a hydro dam on the intercoastal. The intercoastal gets so high that it's hardly affected by the tide, which when the big rains come, the cane farmers in Iberia, St. Mary Parish, and Vermilion are affected by an intercoastal that's swollen with flood water coming down from Lake Foss Point and the whole Alexandria water system of oil, all of that coming, and can't make it to the bay. It has to go west all the way down a much smaller channel. The Charenton Canal is 40 feet deep and 200 feet wide, an 8,000 foot channel. The intercoastal is 12 feet by 150 feet. So you got a 2,000 foot channel. You have 1/4 the capacity. And so that makes an enormous difference in dealing with flood waters. And you know, if we're going to solve the flood problems, we got to be serious about fixing some of these things. St. Mary Parish Levee Board realized that this was a major problem for flooding in the entire system and sought to put it in a project in this big $25 million bonus that was given to the Tetraphymean system to deal with floods. It didn't make the list even. There were about 30 projects, and that project was considered last. At the same time, I placed it in the Coastal Restoration Program, did an engineering drawing of it, and my figures in St. Mary Parish Levee Board was done by a real engineer, and I'm not. Our numbers within 1% of each other. So, but the National Oceanic Administration, they looked at it for about a year and they couldn't get anybody interested, so they dropped it. And so that's where we stand right now. But it's something that has a big effect on the entire area. Another big issue St. Martin Parish has under their control is the Henderson Gate system. And a little history on that. The Henderson Gate was built in the late 60s when Interstate 10 was being constructed across the basin. During low water like we have now, the components and the tugs and barges hauling the components to assemble I-10 across the basin couldn't get up there. So that on an emergency temporary basis, DOTD, Department of Transportation and Development for the state of Louisiana, built an emergency dam. It was a temporary dam only to serve for the building of the highway. And the people at Henderson thought it was real good to keep this thing all the time. So St. Martin Parish inherited this gate. The problem is when the big flood comes down from Alexandria and all lands in Bayou Catawba up in middle St. Landry Parish around Washington, Krotz Springs, so forth. When that comes, we have to dump water into Henderson. During the flood of 016, we couldn't dump it very long because the gates were closed and there was some other obstruction, but essentially the water at Bayou Catawba at Henderson initially was around 8.5 feet. In 24 hours it went to 24 feet. And so it quit draining. So the gates had to be closed, and that was the end. That sent all the water to us. You couldn't send it into the basin because the gates are closed, and there's some other problems too. There's pipelines in there, and when they built I-10, they built the canal across, and it left the spoil bank behind. When the railroad was built in around 1902 or 3, they built the canal with a spoil bank on it, and all that stayed in place, which means that our ability to dump a flood into the Chaffeloy Basin is extremely limited. And so this gate is a problem and should be rebuilt or discarded or totally removed. Worst thing you can do on the natural processes is to build a dam and impound and turn a swamp into a lake. Because when the swamp goes into a lake, then the drying out process that is very important for weed control, aquatic plant control, and for the regrowing of nutrient plants that provide food for crawfish and fish, ducks, and a whole list of other critters, grows when the swamp floor dries out. It also consolidates the mucky bottom into a solid bottom where fish can lay eggs and they'll reproduce. They cannot lay eggs in a soft, super slushy flood bottom. And they can't lay eggs when it's totally filled with hyacinths and hydrilla and other noxious aquatic plants that all disappear when the system dries out. So for lots of reasons, that gate should be removed. As by the same token, Keystone Lock, that gate should be totally removed. I don't think it's safe for a boat to lock through it right now. My guess, the integrity of the system is very much in doubt. I don't know if I'd want to take a boat through it, because opening the lock is when the lock itself is most stressed, and if there's any failure of the foundation, there could be a catastrophic collapse. So St. Martin Parish is very much an important part of what happens to floodwaters in Lafayette, Iberia Parish, even all the way down to St. Mary. It affects the St. Landry Parish, because if waters can't pass, then it backs up in the whole system. And we interviewed farmers, for instance, in Avoyelles Parish and North St. Landry and Whiteville. One of the farmers told us that he got 14 in August 14th of 016. He got something like 14 inches in the rain gauge, and his farm was high and dry. 2 days later, it was 3 feet underwater. He's saying that the water can't drain. The Bayou Teche with a dam on it, the Bayou Catawba with a dam on it, Henderson overfilled. All these things backed up water like a giant lake. So we learned that, and we know that solving a similar flood of 016 is quite doable. It's something that can be done without a lot of big costs. There's not an enormous amount of costs involved in all these things. It's not something that you've got to spend millions of dollars on. You know, the promise is, I think Lafayette Parish is moving very quickly on retention ponds. Well, retention ponds might help in a little 3 or 4 inch rain, but it's not going to do anything in a 24-inch rain. All that's quickly overcome. But to take the swamplands that the good Lord blessed us with, uh, we have the Cypress Island Swamp, which is roughly 30,000 acres of wetland that we can put 10 feet of water. We can stack 300,000 surface acre feet of water in it as we need to. The Lake Foss Point system is enormous, and it goes on from Catahoula to Sharonton, a distance of 35 miles, and it's open lakes and enormous area of wetlands. Um, Granite Cove, all that system, all those swamps around Lake Foss Point. The swamps, a lot more acreage. The lake itself, Lake Foss Point, is I think around 20,000 acres, but you have another 70, 80,000 acres of swamp around it with an average elevation of -2. And so between the lakes, the whole area is -2. The swamp floor is probably right at sea level, and it's all open. It's not restricted by any kind of levees, any kind of roadways. It's all wide open, and the Corps left that behind out of the levee system of the basin for that very purpose, to deal with massive floods that would be in the Teche Vermilion system coming from Alexandria. Now, we've kind of messed up the plumbing. We've really messed up the plumbing because we built dams all over the place. The levee itself is a giant dam. The West Guide levee blocks all the flood water that historically went right into the Chafalaya River or into the Red River. So we've dammed the Red River to the point that Rapides and Falls Parish can no longer drain into it. It all has to drain to us. And so we are faced with, big changes. And as one of the generals said in '93 when we visited, that when they built the levee system, that it changed the whole flood regime for the Teche Vermilion from Alexandria down, and we've kicked the can down the road. He said the first thing should have been taken out was the Keystone Lock and dam, because you were depending on the Teche to carry all the water out, which today is still the same thing. Every bit of water almost has to at one point come through the Teche. The Teche starts up at Port Barre, and it drains to Orneville. So all the water coming from down the Vermilion comes down the Teche first. And then all the water that doesn't go over the dam, it comes down through Lake Foss Point. It gets back into the Teche at Sharonton. So virtually the Teche has to carry the mail all the way. And a dam on it is a super problem for the entire system. And that's a St. Martin Parish thing. I think it's in terrible repair. The requirements that they agreed to accomplish is not being done. When I look at the manual and it shows what needs to be done, my guess it would cost around $50,000 a month to take care of this lock according to this manual. And I don't think they're not doing 1% of the required work. The lock, when they have to do a ice pick test on the gates. The gates have a 20-year life. One set of gates is 40 years old, and the other set is 50 years old. And the Corps stuck St. Martin Parish with this ticket, and with a contractual agreement that says that any repairs required, if it's not accomplished by St. Martin Parish, shall be accomplished by the Corps, with St. Martin Parish picking up the tab for it. paying the bill. So St. Martin Parish is on an enormous hook. If they went and tested that lock and found that the 969 pilot is sitting on a rotten, and the lock is not stable, you couldn't lock both through, and you literally have to tear it out or replace it. Probably would cost $400 or $500 million to replace it, and I don't think St. Martin Parish can afford it, or the Corps. And it serves no commercial function as far as navigation. The last vessel that was locked through with commercial cargo was done by a shell barge carrying 6,000 yards of shell, bringing up the Parks, and that was 1991. And so we're 30 years past the last commercial use of that. And the idea that the Bayou Teche would drain doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because the bottom of the Bayou Teche at its shallowest point is 9-foot elevation at Fort Barry. Well, the manual on operating a Teche-Vermilion says at that point, Catawba cannot be lower than 15.6. So at all times, you would have, at the lowest point, you'd have over 6 feet of water in the Bayou Teche. And so, that world has changed. The idea that 100 years ago, before the levee systems were built, the Bayou Teche would completely drain. Well, that can't happen anymore, because all the water has coming down from Alexandria, from the Bayou Rapides, Bayou Buff, Bayou Kokoda, Bayou Waukegan, Bayou D'Orbon, all of that, Yellow Bayou, all has to come down through Catawba now. So the world has changed. The fact that rice farming in Vermilion Parish has changed, so the need for pumping fresh water out of the Chico Aquifer to support rice is no longer there. Probably 70–80% of the rice land in Vermilion Parish now is converted to sugarcane. A lot of the rice land is not being planted anymore at all, because impacts of hurricanes and salt water getting into staying there for long periods. So we are in a situation where to deal with the flood, and we recently in 1919 Hurricane Barry in June was coming at us, and expected 20 inches of rain. We got that in the northern part of the system, and but we convinced the Teche-Vermilion Freshwater District that the pumps should be turned off so we could drain the water out of the swamps. So I got a call. We'll see if we can take that. You on there? Can we help you?
Yes. I was curious, would removing the Keystone Dam do any or benefit the Cypress Island swamp and community in any way? If so, how?
Okay, right now they have to maintain 3 inches of water over the Keystone Dam. That's part of the Teche-Vermilion plan that the Mississippi River Commission has put in place, and it was, the last revision I think was 1989. To keep 3 inches of water over that dam, you have to put about 900 cubic feet per second down the Vermilion, which keeps the Vermilion, the Surrey Bridge gauge around 6 feet. That puts 2 or 3 feet of water continuously in Cypress Island. And so you've taken a bunch of the watershed retention, and so without the lock, you would drop significantly the waters in Cypress Island. And the problem with Cypress Island, it doesn't drain very well. So in the flood of 2016, listen to this, to go back to the flood stage. Flood stage is 10 at the Surrey Bridge. it took 31 days to go back to flood stage. That's why the homes over there on Lake Martin Road and everything stayed under 3 or 4 weeks. The trailer park by Lake Martin, all of that was under, all those homes in St. Martin Parish towards Cecilia and all, around Orneville, below Orneville, towards Sunset. All that stayed underwater for a whole 30 days. Cypress Island can't drain very well because it's got a small opening, but the fact that the Vermilion below drained very well. It took 4.5 days for Abbeville to go back to flood stage. So the fact that it's staying flooded, we had more water go down to Vermilion than we had go over the Keystone Dam, according to the figures we have, and that's not exact because some of that water went around Cypress Island completely. All throughout the UL Farm, Spanish Lake and Cypress Island was one. So it's hard to get an exact number on that. But for sure, taking out the Keystone, as was suggested in '93, would lower the Dickens out of Cypress Island. And the Corps' computer model showed you're talking about lowering water levels in the Vermilion, which includes Cypress Island, 6 to 8 feet. You do that, and you eliminate the flooding in St. Martin Parish from a big rain event. Now that's the Corps' model, and there's numbers. So the Keystone forces water down to Vermilion that keeps the Cypress Island flooded all the time, to the point that the Nature Conservancy says that bird populations are dropping, that deer populations are dropping, that trees are dying like the Dickens, the trees dying because they're staying underwater all the time. It's no longer a swamp, it's become a lake. That's a big problem for St. Martin Parish.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you so much for calling in. Appreciate it. I think
Sure.
we take out the Keystone, we'll solve lots of problems. And the big fear is that Teche will go dry. It's a historic waterway. The numbers do not add up. The Teche Vermilion has to keep the water up there at Port Barry, the top of the Teche, at 15.6. That's the lowest they can let it go. They will turn on the pumps or whatever's necessary to keep it at they normally keep it at 18. But the lowest they can let it get is 15.6, which puts almost 7 feet of water at Port Barry. The Catawba there is -5, and the Teche at Port Barry is +9. So you would always have water in the Teche. At the shallowest point, you'd have 6 feet. In the lowest condition, that Teche Vermilion can allow it to get.
All right. Well, thank you, man.
All right, thank you so much for calling. Yes, sir. So I hope that, that to take out Teche Vermilion, take out the lock was really important. But getting back to what I was discussing with Hurricane Barry, and our news reporters at the U.S. Weather Service, with their computer models, and the USGS, showed that water at Surrey Bridge would come to 16.9. Now the water in a flood of 16 came to 17.2. So there's 3 inches difference roughly. So if you had, a foot of water, instead of a foot, you would only had 9 inches. I don't think that makes anybody feel good, but that was the computer models with the rain, the storm surge, all these things. So this is the worst that we could have, a high rain event. We had a hurricane storm surge that didn't occur in 2016, and we had a Chafla River at Butler Rose at flood stage at 19.9, flood stage is 20. So we couldn't dump water into the Chafla, but we did convince, with the help of Bill Fontenot, we convinced to turn the pumps off and we lowered the stages. You're on the air, can we help you?
Yeah. Is this Ecologic?
You got it. Yes, sir. How can we help you?
Well, I just wanted to ask Harold a question.
Shoot, I'm ready.
Oh, okay. Is this Harold?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to ask about the Keystone locks. About what's the history on it? Like, was the water? Was there a different level or something of where the water moved faster or something like that? And what was going on there at Keystone, or was there nothing going on there?
Nothing. You see, it's a fixed overcrest dam, big concrete dam, and it's at 10-foot elevation. And
Why'd they put it there?
they put it there to get boats. This is 1913. To get tugs and barges to the Brobridge Sugar Mill. Head of navigation is that old railroad bridge at the sugar mill. You remember the old railroad bridge at Sugar Mill?
Yeah.
That's why you have a lift bridge there in Brobridge, which they just got through repainting and making it look real nice.
And that's upstream, right?
That's right.
From there.
Upstream, that's right. Upstream.
And because there used to be that Belmont plantation that had a water wheel supposedly. And I figured maybe they had some kind of current there, and I figured maybe there was something. Why they put the locks? I thought it was some kind of level difference or something like that.
There is a big. You see, normally the water below the dam is the same as Lake Falls Point, which is the same as Vermilion Bay. It'll be from -2 to +3 or 4.
But before the dam, it was like that before the dam too.
Yes. And you see what would happen
natural.
in 1913. Water transportation was everything. That's how you moved everything.
Sure.
Because we had no roads and railroads didn't go where you wanted them to go and so forth. So, but the sugar mill wanted to haul that sugar out by barge, and the test would go dry because it was hooked up to Bayou Catawba, which drained right into the Chafly River. And when the Chafly River would go down to like 4 feet, that's what it is today, the Bayou Teche is at +9, so it would be dry. You could walk across it. Somebody sent me pictures of it where people are walking across it. They're right below Port Barre. And
wow.
But that world has changed. You see, they put the levee in the way, so now it doesn't. It can't go down with the river. It stays up, and then they put dams all over in it. You put a dam, it can't drain into Bayou Ami by Pats anymore. You got two big 500-foot dams there to keep the water in the Teche. So there's no way
that they did when they did the interstate, like you were saying earlier.
Well, they built those dams in 1942. That was way back then because they wasn't getting enough water down the Teche and Vermilion for rice irrigation and so forth. So
right.
They kept
and then now when you say 4 feet, and you say that Chafly is at that now, what do you mean 4 feet below flood stage?
Flood stage at Butte Rose is at 20 feet. And right now the Chafly is 4.4 feet above sea level. So it when there's no water coming down from Cairo, Illinois, and all the way down, the rivers go down. And we got no snow and drought conditions. We normally have a rise in November, which we will not get. So we may have a very low water in the Chafly Basin this year. All indications are it's going to be very low water. But that low water doesn't affect the Bayou Teche at all. The Bayou Teche is kept up by Bayou Catawba, and it's kept up with this dam, which forces all of it down to Vermilion. So people are concerned if you took the dam off, the historic Bayou Teche would be dry like would happen in 1912. That can't happen because we have a big pump system that under the rules they're required to keep it at Port Barre. The lowest they can let it get is 15.6, and they normally keep it at 18. And so I think there's 3 months, they can let it go down to 15.6. That's November, December, and January. But that's the lowest it could get, which would always keep 6 feet or more water in the Teche, whether there was a dam there or not.
And so
That's one of the big concerns people have, but it would help St. Martin Parish in terms of flooding to take that dam out. It would make, instead of 2/3 of water going down to a little bit of Vermilion, 2/3 would go down to Teche. It would help fishing, help everything, let it go.
Right.
The dam blocks
Wow.
fish from coming in. So I was in a meeting about the Bayou Teche, and they want to stock the Bayou Teche with fish. So all you have to do is open the locks, let the fish, Lake Falls Point is full of fish. Let them come right up the bayou. You don't have to stock it, but why not just get rid of this piece of, I mean, it's probably not safe to go through anymore, and somebody like St.
Right.
Martin Parish is stuck with having to fix it. And if that locks is in deplorable condition, St. Martin Parish agreed to pay to fix it. That's on their ticket. That's in their contract.
So further down, then you have the Wax Lake Outlet. You have the floodgates there where the Teche crosses.
Yeah, the Teche, the can't drain. Those gates are useless now because I was there about a week ago, and you got a sandbar all across where those gates are. Both
Wow.
where Bayou Teche goes to Patterson and where Bayou Teche goes to Franklin. They can open the gates, but nothing will go through. So
And because of all this water coming through the Wax Lake Outlet from the basin or whatever.
that's right. And if there's any spot, you see, the wax is taking it all over. It's carrying all the
Right.
flow. So any spot where there's no current is going to drop sediment like crazy. So it's totally filled in the Teche.
What about the Berwick locks? Now, you would get rid of that too, or what?
No. The Berwick
And
lock.
the floodgates. What would you do with those floodgates and the Wax Lake Outlet and all? What would you do down there? Is that part of the?
No, that's not part of it. I mean,
That's not.
the
that's
Wax
not
Lake
big water.
outlet has gone from original depth of 50 feet to 110 to 120. And it has phenomenal flow rates. I was there in
Right.
May. The water under the bridges at Morgan City was flowing at 1.8 miles an hour, and the water at the bridges on the Wax was flowing at 5.9 miles an hour. It's phenomenal, the current
Which
through
is
there.
what the Chapel Eyes should be flowing at.
That
maybe,
is shaft live. You see, for the shaft live to stay open, it's got to flow at that rate. If it drops to 1 mile an hour, it's going to fill. You got sandbars in Morgan City, in the middle of the river, in Morgan City. Seagulls
Wow.
walking all over them. I mean, that
Wow.
river's filling it. It's from where the Wax start to American Pass, which is American Pass right above, about 5 miles north of Morgan City. The water's only 7 or 8 feet deep. I was there 3 days ago. I was wondering how the tugs and boarders would get in the middle of the river, where the channel is marked. It was 7 feet deep. Now, little tugs are going up and down, but I don't think those big tugs with a draft of 10 or 12 feet can go up. So the river's Horseshoe Bend below Morgan City is 6 feet of water. I was there 6 months ago, and I thought I was running on a sandbar because it should have been 30 feet deep. So I slowed
So
down and just went across it, and the deepest part was 6 feet. A big
Wow.
supply boat cannot come up from the Gulf to Market City. To get there, they'd have to go up the intercoastal from Freshwater Bay.
And so that's a whole nother.
Whole
Story,
nother thing.
right.
Yeah, whole nother thing.
Is it fixable? You think, in your opinion?
What's that?
Is it fixable in
As
your
far as the
opinion?
flood condition, yeah, we have everything we need to fix Lafayette's flood. Take out the Keystone. We have a plan to put a diversion, just like they have in the Mississippi, that would take the Ildecan water and send it to Vermilion Bay in 15 hours instead of 30 days.
Right.
These diversions are all over the Mississippi. The wife and I went from St. Louis back to Butte La Rose 4 years ago, and ran into one of these, hydro dams, hydro diversion. When a river comes into the Mississippi, they don't just let it plow in. They divert it to the main part of the channel. And we think that do one of these on a million would direct that big flood coming out of the Keene, this giant canal.
And-
And
and
it
so
was
that
a
was-
million made 15 hours instead of 30 days, and which would save
But a lot-
Cypress Island from flooding.
But this would help the flow in the Chapel too, I guess. Huh?
It would
Maybe
help
we'll-
everything up because of a million blocks, everything.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for your
Well,
call.
And I also want to say thank you so much for
Well,
for what you're doing. So,
No telling what volunteers can do. They promise if we fix this, they're gonna double our pay. So, thank you for your interest.